His vest looked greasy and frayed at the edges, and one of the pockets kept flapping half torn at his side. In spite of his age, my dad could be very energetic, and combined with his weight, he could develop a scary amount of momentum. So if one of his pockets got stuck on, let's say, a nail on the wall, he either ripped out the nail or more frequently left half the pocket hanging on the wall. The black, half-rotten shoulder bag was filled to the brim with pen and paper, tools, and an entire first aid kit, and honestly looked like he'd bought it from the next best homeless guy around the corner, with how many times it seemed to have been stitched back together from scratch. The sweater underneath showed suspicious traces of flour from his latest baking spree. He'd probably jumped straight from the kitchen into the car, because he'd decided he needed to bake another batch of sugar-free gingerbread at the last second before picking us up. That was typically my dad. Doing something or starting another project at the last second when there really wasn't any time. An example. We have an electric model train, and my dad had caught the idea that he needed to create a picturesque papier-mâché mountain range to place in between the rails. Now, every other father would have made time on a Saturday afternoon and actually try and do a proper job. Not my dad. He'd have an hour or less between confirmation class and another visit and cram a project that would take anyone several hours into that time frame, slapping some paper and glue on a cartoon frame and calling it a day. At first, it looked horrendous, but after he'd painted it with watercolors, we could actually use it as a panorama for our train system. So that was one time my dad got away with his 1 hour project. Others of his spur of the momentum decisions went horribly wrong. Once he tried to build a marble roller coaster a blink before bedtime, at maybe 9 p.m., but he drastically underestimated the time he'd need and had to give up, leaving everyone unpleasantly frustrated and unhappy. Anyway, the flour was still deeply ingrained into his sweater. His pant legs were sprinkled with mud from his latest bike ride through the rain, and his shoes were in a similarly desolate state. One of the shoelaces was half untied, so that my father was at constant risk of falling face first onto the floor. I hope you can picture what my dad looked like, even if I still can't provide you a picture of him. He truly wasn't an apparition I could go on bragging sprees with him being neither slim nor good looking, nor pleasant smelling, nor well dressed, nor particularly socially adept. At least he didn't smell of alcohol and cigarettes the way I'd seen it with some of my classmates' parents. He gave Bubblegum a boop on the nose, and I hugged him most briefly, which I didn't do very often anyway, because he did look like some dirt-ridden, unkempt cave animal most of the time. Maybe he told good stories and made mediocrely funny jokes, but you really didn't want to cuddle up to him. I noticed the clouded look on his face that wasn't dimmed in the slightest by his otherwise friendly grin. It was the last thing I saw before I crawled into the car onto my preferred seat. Literally, the car was already much too small for my dad and had its fair share of flaws. The tailgate was broken, and my dad could only open the tailgate by crawling over the back seat and open it manually from the inside. The fuller the trunk was, the more difficult and less fun it became. The broken tailgate was, however, far from the only thing wrong with my dad's small blue car. The car radio with its CD player tended to die at least 3 or 4 times during an average car ride, and you have to completely remove it to reconnect it with the car's electricity system. Why? Only God knew. The actual radio was a hit or miss itself, mostly playing white noise because my dad had once snapped off the car's antenna while trying to transport half a tree's worth of wood on the roof of this car. The car battery, especially during the winter, and especially once the temperatures started dipping below zero, liked to quit service time and time again, often leaving the car stranded on the most remote parts of Germany's highways or forests. Every passenger of the car was strictly forbidden from letting down the driver's window because there was a risk of it getting stuck, which could get extremely unpleasant extremely quickly, and the inside of the car was leathered with breadcrumbs and wrapping papers in all shapes and colors. I have to admit, Bubblegum and I were very much at fault for that one. We had to sit in the car for hours on end, and obviously my dad couldn't park the car at a rest stop every time either of us wanted to snack on a piece of chocolate or one of the already mentioned salami sandwiches. That way, it often happened that the lone breadcrumb or 50 found its way onto the floor of the car. And sometimes you simply forgot to put the wrapping paper into the dirt sack and just let it fall onto your seat. That's what we called the car's trash bag. That was really just a scrap plastic bag that had been hung up over the car's gear stick. Aside from the dirt sack, there was also the wet sack that contained all sorts of water bottles and juice packets, and of course, the munchie snack that contained the aforementioned kitchen. That brought me right back to Janine, who was usually put in charge of managing the kitchen and most of the accruing waste. Was it hard to drive without Janine? I asked my dad as soon as he'd successfully opened the tailgate from inside the car, at the cost of probably several back dislocations. Yes, he answered swiftly. I do miss her quite a bit. We might not talk all the time, but it's much nicer to have someone sitting next to you. It makes me feel a lot more comfortable and a lot less troubled. But now that you kids are here, the trip back's going to be much easier to manage. He tried to keep the mood up because I knew he disliked being alone in a car for too long. He got all sorts of anxiety and panic attacks, but I think I already told you that. But Dad, it's only the trip back for you, not for us, I corrected him. Really, adults got the easiest things mixed up all the time. Sure, you're right, said he, and it seemed like he'd already left the conversation mentally and arrived at a completely different place for himself. There was an aspect of my dad that was both pleasant and unpleasant. His brain was filled to the brim with thoughts and dreams and wild ideas, and Janine had once confessed that it was downright exhausting to have to live with him every single day of the year.